after a long transitional period, I think starting with the Six-Day War in 1967, we can see the beginning, I think it was as late as the 70s, so the Battle of Lewisham or the Anti-Nazi League, the kind of official leadership continued as they had in the 30s to kind of advise caution. By the 90s, things were changing, and I think around the beginning of the 90s, when the current Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, was inaugurated, communal leaders were starting to highlight various sources of insecurity and risk threatening the community. In the 90s, it was mainly risks such as declining rates of synagogue observance, the risks of secularization, risks of intermarriage. So Jonathan Sacks, early in his term as Chief Rabbi, published a book called Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? And there was a lot of emphasis on the kind of fear of declining numbers in the community. Declining numbers that were, of course, partly a result of the assimilationist ethos having been too successful. In the current century, the threats most often stressed are external, anti-Semitism, the threats of anti-Semitism, especially what's called the new anti-Semitism, with anti-Semitic incidents in Britain and elsewhere rising and spiking a number of times after the start of the Second Intifada in 2000 and the War on Terror the year after. And so the contrast between that earlier moment of kind of denying anti-Semitism up to the 70s and the current moment when, for example, Jonathan Sacks has spoken about a tsunami of anti-Semitism is, I think, quite instructive, that shift. But equally instructive, I think, is the dissent offered to those communal strategies by radicals within the community. So in the 30s to the 70s, communists and other left Zionist groups led the fight against fascism when the communal leaders refused to act. Now, I think left-wing Jews often tend to react to the tsunami of anti-Semitism model by minimizing the threat of anti-Semitism. David Hirsch has used the term the new conservatives to describe this kind of denial of anti-Semitism from much of the Jewish left, and pointing out how this denial echoes the earlier denial of the communal kind of bigwigs. And I think one common trope used by these, what he calls the new conservatives, in denying or minimizing contemporary anti-Semitism is the idea of Islamophobia as the new anti-Semitism. So, for example, in August, The Guardian's Commenters Free carried an article by Maya Guarnieri entitled Islamophobia, the New Anti-Semitism. And she concluded, in the past there was anti-Semitism rolling just below the surface, now there is Islamophobia. So then there was anti-Semitism, now there is Islamophobia. Shlomo Sands, in an essay written also, I think in July, for the Jewish Quarterly, made the same point. His article was called From Judeophobia to Islamophobia. Across the Atlantic, in The Tablet, which is a Jewish magazine, not the same as Catholic magazine in this country, Daniel Luban wrote an article called The New Anti-Semitism, subtitled Recent Attacks on Islam Echo Slurs Against Jews. He said the problem for things like the Anti-Defamation League is that there isn't that much anti-Semitism of consequence these days, and many of the tropes of classical anti-Semitism have been revived and given new force, but their targets are not Jews but Muslims. I find this narrative of Islamophobia as the new anti-Semitism problematic for a number of reasons. First, I think it ignores the very real differences between the material conditions and patterns of exclusion experienced by Jews a century ago and Muslims today, and therefore often leads to quite a kind of ahistorical mode of analysis. And I think it's very important to kind of, as a couple of speakers have already spoken about, seeing racism, such as racism against Jews or Muslims, as part of a kind of wider structures and patterns of exclusion. Second, I think by relegating anti-Semitism to the past, this trope denies the very real manifestations of anti-Semitism, both discursive and violent physical manifestations, which can clearly be evidenced today. Third, I think it accepts the earlier assimilationist logic in implying that Jews are now unproblematically part of the dominant white majority. I think there's an issue there around the way that the earlier assimilationist logic of saying that Jews are white British citizens has kind of taken on a different life. Fourth, though, and this is the point I'll conclude on, I think it promotes a kind of zero-sum approach to different racisms. And I think this is something which can be seen in a number of, not just in that context, but a number of cases within the anti-racist movement, a kind of perverse calculus by which racisms are measured against each other, with the intensity of one necessarily diminishing the value of the other. So I tried to organise a conference a couple of years ago on Islamophobia and anti-racism, and I found that it was very hard to find people that were interested in both, that people were either felt that one was, you know, at fever pitch and the other was not significant, or the other way around. And I think that this is obviously bad policy for anti-racists, and instead I think that we need to combat, if we want to combat anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim racism together, that is both Jews and Muslims together, but both racisms together, then we need to attend to the commonalities and the continuities between them, as well as to the contrasts and specificities which make each of them distinct and each of them in some ways unique. And I think that's the kind of point I want to conclude on, really, that the anti-racist movement needs to find better ways, I think, of attending to the specificities within different racisms. So, just to repeat Dr. Karim's point, there is not one thing that is Islamophobia, but it contains a spectrum of different manifestations, from the very, you know, casual discursive through to violent forms of aggression, and the same with other racism.